In the last section, we managed to use our form key right here to get a reference to the FormState instance that belongs to this form. Once we had that reference to the FormState, we then called the reset method on the FormState, and we very clearly saw that that reset every one of the inputs within our form. So if we reference back to our diagram that we were looking at a little bit ago, over here, we've clearly accomplished part number 1 of this. We have direct access to the FormState instance that represents our form on the screen. So now we're going to move on to part 2 of this, which is to tell it to validate all the text form fields that are nested underneath it. To do so, let's first take a look at some documentation and get a better sense of how we're going to use the FormState to tell it to validate all the text form fields that are inside. Okay, so I've got my FormState documentation up. I'm going to go down to my method section. So in the last section we called reset. There it is right there. So we're looking at the same section. And right underneath that, you'll notice that there's another method called validate. So if we call validate, that's going to apparently validate every form field that is nested within this form. And then if they are all valid, if all those form fields are valid, then the overall validate call that we're going to make is going to return true. Otherwise, it will return false to indicate that one of our inputs has some invalid input inside of it. Now, when you look at this method right here and the description for validate, this is a function that is tied to our FormState class. You'll notice that the documentation doesn't say anything at all about how this validation is actually done. In other words, how are we going to make sure that the text form field that represents our password actually is a password? Like, we need to make sure that whatever gets entered into this field right here specifically looks like a password, and so maybe it has to have a certain number of characters. And likewise, we need to make sure that when this validation step occurs, this text form field that represents the email has to look like an email. So it has to have, like, an @ character or @ symbol inside of it or something like that. So the documentation here is kind of lacking in that regard. The documentation is not telling you how you set a validation rule up. And in fact, in my opinion, all the documentation here not super clear on how you set up this validation stuff. So rather than trying to reference any documentation, I'm going to show you a diagram that's going to make this entire validation flow a little bit more obvious. Okay, here we go. All right, so here's what happens. Right now, we're inside of our login screen, or more precisely, the login screen state. We've created our global key, which represents or kind of references the FormState object. And as we just saw, the FormState has a method tied to it called validate. So that's the documentation we were just looking at. That's the validate function right here. So when we call validate, here's what happens. The validate function is going to look at all of the children of the form widget. And it's going to find every single instance underneath the form of a text form field. And so the validate function is going to automatically find this text form field and this text form field. Then on both of those text form field instances, the validate function right here is going to call a function that you and I can optionally pass into the constructor of the text form field called validator. The validator function right here is what is actually responsible for looking at the value that has been entered into the text form field and saying whether or not it is valid. Okay, so this validator part right here might seem a little bit confusing, so let's go make one quick change inside of our code editor and you'll see where this validator thing comes into play. So I'm going to go back to my code editor. I'm going to find my email field. Here's the text form field. And as an additional property to the constructor, I'm going to pass in a function called validator, or a property called validator a function to the validator property. There we go. So now this function right here is going to be automatically called anytime we call the validate function on FormState. So now inside that validator function, we're going to have the opportunity to inspect the value that was entered into our text form field. And if that value is valid and we like it, we're going to return nothing. Otherwise, we will return a string that represents the error message that we want to show to the user. So essentially on this validator function, we're going to return null if valid, otherwise string with the error message if invalid. Okay, so hopefully now that makes a little bit more sense. So when we call validate on the FormState instance, validate is going to find all of the nested text form fields. It's going to call the validator function on each one. It's going to collect all those things together, all the responses or all the return values from these different validator functions, and it's going to say, hey, are any of you not null? Like, did any of you have an issue? And if there is an issue, then the validate function back up here that belongs to the FormState instance is going to say, oh, sorry, no, that form is not valid. Like, one of these fields is wrong, and the user is going to have to go fix it. All right, so that's the behind the scenes look at what is going on with this validate stuff. So let's take a quick pause here. We're going to come back to the next section, and we're going to write out our validator function for both our email field and our password field. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute.